Donald Trump has been described as more of a Tony Soprano than Benito Mussolini. Democrats, most of the left, are screaming authoritarian, but it's more like a mobster-y kind of style. That's likely because the Donald is less about the ideology and even the nationalism than about the consolidation and expression of his own personal power. And arguably, even more than that, is the narcissistic demand for attention and favors and acknowledgement in a very emotional way of superiority and control. And what the DC environment, the zeitgeist in Washington now reminds me of is the time I worked at Near North Insurance in Chicago in the early 90s. And that period of time in my own life came to mind when I thought of one of its most colorful and memorable personalities. Hello and welcome to the No Hair All Heart podcast. I am your host, Mookie Spitz. Got no hair, but I've got a lot of heart. And I fondly remember Mr. Ira Colitz. He was born in 1916, and he had the corner office on the upper floor of the John Hancock building in the offices of his buddy and colleague, Mickey Siegel. Now, Ira and Mickey and George Dunn and a long list of power brokers in Chicago went way back. Some of these guys were childhood friends in the old Jewish neighborhoods on the West Side. They grew up together and they grew powerful together, often with each other's clout. Now, Mickey was quite a character. At the time, I was hired as a temporary secretary, the lowest rung of the power hierarchy, I would guess, aside from maybe the janitorial service. And I loved it at the time. The last thing I wanted was a career. This was the early 90s. I had cracked 30 years old, and the very last thing I wanted to do was grow up. So to facilitate my Peter Pan existence, I signed up at a bunch of temporary staffing agencies, and they would give me assignments. Now, the assignments would vary from a day to a week, sometimes extending into months. And there were a couple occasions where the assignments translated into full-time employment. They got used to me, I got used to them at these companies, and it just seemed optimal to me at the time, even though I didn't want a real job, to, instead of just getting an hourly rate, which was arguably 30% of what the client was paying for me, to make a little bit more money and get the benefits and actually, I don't know, have a career. You couldn't really call it that with the remedial tasks that I was given. But I wanted to write. I wanted to live an itinerant, unattached life. And this gave me cover, at least in perception, if not in practice, that I was an artist. Maybe not starving at the point where I actually took one of these jobs, but nonetheless still pretty fringe, even if I worked in mainstream organizations. Now, Near North proved to be one of these flips where I started as a temporary secretary in the staffing pool of their loss control department. And that was fitting too, because I felt that my entire life was an exercise in loss control. And I was in one of those island cubes. It wasn't an open office arrangement, which became the rage 20 years later. So there were still corner offices and window offices, and the hierarchy was self-evident when you just walked the floor. And again, due to my lowly station, I was in a cube in an island with some of the other loss control guys and gals. It was a small team within a team. And I believe that the duties were essentially what the name prescribed, which was evaluating and determining the validity of various corporate claims for insurance. So there I was. In the corner office, a large executive suite that was kitty corner from my point of view in the cube, was the office of Mr. Ira Colitz. He must have been in his late 70s at the time, and his office was expansive and could have been a museum. If you walked in there, there was a huge leather couch, a gigantic walnut desk, and every square inch of the walls were covered with celebrity pictures with Ira posing and gagging and mugging the camera with the likes of every championship boxer you can imagine and every major political figure over the last half century, mostly Democrats, but from both sides of the aisle. Now, Ira was an executive vice president at Near North Insurance, and he had worked with his buddy Mickey, as I mentioned. George Dunn himself would pop in and say hi to old Ira. And Ira had made a name for himself as the president of the Democrat 42nd Ward, some kind of title like that. He was an operative. He was an influencer. He was a mover and shaker in Chicago politics. This was the era of Big Daddy Daley. And clout was then, as it is now, the glue and fuel and modus operandi of getting stuff done in the Windy City. Now, as president of the 42nd Ward for the Democrats, Ira's position at that time and his level of influence was, I think, mostly symbolic. He was showing his age. He didn't weather that well. He was tall and thin, wrinkled and rickety, and he would shamble around the office. And this was in the days well before political correctness and Me Too. And he would ogle the female staff. He would literally walk up to a woman, one of my fellow colleagues, and go, "Hey, toots, you got a nice ass." And other expressions of his affection. He had racial slurs that were equally common. And again, Ira embodied old school Chicago melding of politics and business. The two were inseparable. I heard amazing stories of how Mickey got started with Near North Insurance. Apparently, he had an opportunity through his buddy George Dunn to have a major city contract. I believe it might even have been the new Sears Tower at the time. And Mickey had a fledgling business. So what he apparently did, and I heard this story fondly recalled from a number of people at the organization, Mickey went to Second City and he hired dozens of stand-up comics and actors, rented a large office space in downtown Chicago, populated it with these actors and fake telephones. And as the powers that be were being taken on a tour of Mickey's alleged flourishing insurance business at the time, Mickey would take them through rooms of rushed and haggard and stressed out Second City actors and stand-ups who were busy yelling into phones and gesticulating. And oh boy, did Mickey have a busy, engaged organization substantiating his ability, no doubt, to deliver what the city was demanding in terms of comprehensive insurance coverage for the next major city project. And that was one of dozens of stories on how businesses were won and clout was built in the city of big shoulders, where it wasn't what you knew or even what you actually did, but who you knew and which shoulders you were tapping and which envelopes, presumably, you were handing. Now, Mickey, just to continue the trajectory of this story, got busted. In 2002, he was indicted for insurance and mail fraud, wire fraud, racketeering charges. His own senior executive leadership, and they were in offices directly opposite on the same floor where I was in loss control, and Ira was ogling the ladies. The senior executive team, including Mickey's office, was right across the way. And apparently they ratted him out. And the charge was really centered around Mickey using what was, I think, called the Premium Trust Fund or Premium Trust Fund account, where it was basically an insurance policy for the insurance company. It held like $20 million in liquid funds that could be dipped into in the event of client need. Now, that was expressly kept pristine, but Mickey apparently was digging into it, and it got ugly. Mickey was using the funds for all the good stuff that Mickey was allegedly known for. And again, this is all hearsay. I in no way want to cloud this man's reputation. But, he was accused, and this is public domain, of infractions like using the money for Bulls tickets, prostitutes, drugs, what have you. So the trial and the accusations, it was all pretty ugly at the time. And Mickey went down. He was convicted and he was in jail until, I believe, 2012. So I bring all this up not to cast shade or any kind of judgment on Mickey, Near North Insurance, the organization, but just to illustrate whether guilty or innocent, the chickens came home to roost, at least in terms of this reputation of a mobster attitude and mentality. This was real. And I saw a lot of that attitude and that MO. And frankly, that high level of woo and charm. It's the same kind of woo and charm that lured in audiences who loved The Sopranos, who love gangster movies, because you got this tough guy persona who gets it done, doesn't take shit from anybody, and is the self-made man living the American dream, at least in this old school kind of way. And it was exemplified by Mickey, who got busted. It was exemplified by Ira, who got busted, I think, in the mid-70s for extortion, playing around with zoning rights. I don't know the details of that either. But he, not surprisingly, got off. And I think Ira got off because it was a couple decades before the hammer of the law started coming down and racketeering charges became a thing, and Mickey got busted and did time. Now, I'm an introvert when it comes to my maniacal artistic pursuits, to the point where I was just stubbornly in this Peter Pan mode, as I mentioned, jumping from job to job. And I didn't take any of this really seriously, except I loved seeing these different business environments. Part of the charm of working as a temporary secretary for literally years. And as I'm saying, into my 30th year plus, was not only to skirt adult responsibility, but to interact in these dynamic ecosystems that varied. I was in an architecture firm for a while. This was an insurance company with all these old school characters. I worked in all of these environments in the late 80s, in the 90s, early 90s. And it was fuel for thought and experience. And I met a lot of interesting people, including Ira Colitz. Now, Ira would shamble around and he saw me, and I have an energy. Everyone's got an energy. And again, I might be this introverted type, and I certainly was at the time, but Ira recognized I had a spark. Or maybe simply I paid attention to him because he had a spark. Ira had energy. Of course he did. How do you do what Ira did, especially in his youth, without being Mr. Personality? I found him fascinating. And he must have recognized that. And when this toots or that toots refused to go to lunch with him, Ira would say, "Hey, buddy, you want to go get some lunch? We'll go to Maxwell Street and get some brats." So I said, "Oh yeah, all right, let's go." So I think literally over the course of about a year or so that I worked at Near North Insurance in the early 90s, I went to lunch with Ira Colitz at least a half dozen times. And it wasn't a gay thing. This guy was as straight can be, and in a pre-Me Too inappropriate kind of way. He just liked the company. And he liked the fact that I was noticeably fascinated by this guy. And I couldn't get enough of his stories. And he wasn't always 100% lucid. And he was distracted. And he was, of course, disappointed that he couldn't have a hot chick in a limo with him. But I went. And it was the same kind of story. He said, meet me by the garage. So I would do that. I would go down to the garage in like 10 minutes. I'd probably have to wait another 10, 15 minutes. His driver would show up with his old Cadillac limo, and then I'd get in, and Ira and I would go to Maxwell Street for a Polish, or sometimes to a Jewish deli. And again, sometimes Ira was amazing, and other times he was mumbling to the point I didn't even understand what he was saying. But I cherished these moments with Ira Colitz. It was kind of like the king inviting the jester to court and dazzling the jester with the stories of his knighthood. And I loved it. I loved it. And eventually I left Near North Insurance. There are other Near North Insurance stories that I'll share. But for this one, I really want to focus on Ira. And Ira left such an impression, even with these limited little exchanges that I had with him, that here's one of the most fascinating psychic occurrences that I can share. And I know that this is an awkward and probably abrupt segue from George Dunn, Mickey Siegel, the 42nd Ward, and old school politics, and our current DC administration, which is pretty much cut from that same cloth. But visualize for a second. Several years later, we're looking at, I believe, like 1998. I am at the corner fast food place on my street. It's the corner Cornelia and Broadway on Chicago's north side. I lived up the street on Cornelia for years. And again, I had left Near North years before. I was still kind of an itinerant artist type. I believe by this point I had shifted to a local bar job. I was writing for the local paper. I was still all over the place, but living this life of being disconnected from adulthood, essentially, and responsibility. And I loved it. So visualize me sitting on a stool at one of those window seats in a small Chicago fast food joint. I think the place was called Billy Bob's. Seriously. It was owned by a Greek or some similar neighboring country's emigre. He worked there with his daughter and wife, it seemed. It was a family-run little fast food place, and they had old school Chicago gyro sandwiches, the mystery meat on the spit. So for $5.50, I had a gyro and fries and a bottle of hot sauce, so much of which I would pour all over the stuff that the old owner got mad that I was eating into his profits by going through bottles of hot sauce. Anyway, I'm pouring the hot sauce on my gyro with fries, looking out the window, seated on a stool. It's a random weekday, springtime in Chicago. 1998 is my guess. And there's an open newspaper, the Chicago Sun-Times. The Chicago Sun-Times had a magazine-like format. This went back even to my childhood. The Chicago Tribune was classic New York Times style big format. You had to unfold it. This is pre-digital stuff. And the Chicago Sun-Times was like a magazine. You just opened it laterally. You didn't unfold it. And the newspaper was open on the counter a few feet from me, and it was near the door, and the door was open, and the spring breeze was blowing in, and it was like a movie. The newspaper just opened itself to some inside pages. And as I'm sitting there spacing out and eating and just kind of enjoying the stillness, I just reach over and take a look at the page that the newspaper had seemingly randomly opened to. And I remember this like it was yesterday. And I look down and it's an obituary. And I know that you know where this story is going. I scan the names, and my eye goes directly to the obituary of Ira Colitz, president of the 42nd Ward Democratic Organization, mover and shaker of Chicago politics and business. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that I was seeing what I was seeing. I had that moment, and this has happened to me many times in my life, where I feel like the veils part, where we live in one world and there's this mythical, oft described in poetic and magical terms world. And like a Venn diagram, the two circles overlap, and they do so briefly and unexpectedly. And when the worlds merge, you get this feeling of timelessness, and you're still in your world, but the worlds have meshed. And it's so fantastic and banal at the same time that you can't get yourself to cognitively believe what your senses are demonstrating. And when I'm in these moments, of which I've had several, I've already related a few on this podcast, and I'm sure I'm going to talk about more in the future. When this convergence happens, that timeless feeling saturates me. And there's this feeling where my brain is telling, one part of my brain is telling another part of my brain, maybe my third eye is cutting in, saying that what you're seeing and feeling right now, just, is it really happening? There's this question mark. It's almost like a protection. I feel so vulnerable and naked as the veil parts and these worlds merge that I'm exposed. And then my cognitive self tries to rationalize this merger. And my cognitive energy is going to this, wow, I can't believe this is happening. Is this really real? What's going on here? While emotionally, I could feel it in the depth of my gut and soul that the lines have been crossed, the boundaries are now transparent, and I'm making a connection. And it was exactly this pastiche of feelings that I felt when I'm staring at the obituary of Ira Colitz. And even more so than that, what was so pronounced about this spiritual experience was the distinct feeling that Ira was saying goodbye. Now, I reiterate, I was a peon. I was the fool in the court, and he was the prince. He was the king. But we had made an emotional connection, human to human. And I found him fascinating, and he knew it. And we both had that same kind of woo, that same kind of mischievous energy. And he recognized it in me, and I, of course, recognized it in him. That connecting of worlds happened when we were connected, back in space, back in time, back at those offices, on those weird lunch outings that we went on. We had connected then to the point where I think he came to say bye. I could hear his voice in my ear, in my head, in my soul. Hey, buddy, I checked out. I just wanted to say, so long. All right. And then I felt like saving the newspaper, those clips that people carry. And again, this was pretty much a pre-digital world still. But I left the newspaper there. And I think I just closed it almost out of deference to the sanctity of his memory and the celebration of his visit. I left the newspaper there rather than taking it with me as this artifact. It seemed to be forced and artificial because it's not about the newspaper. It was about that connection. Ira said, goodbye, buddy. And in that goodbye, I think there might even have been a little wink and wishing me well. But it wasn't even about that. It was never really about me. It was about Ira, and I was okay with that. I celebrated that even back then, and he knew it, and he was saying goodbye. And I was thankful for our connection back then, as I am thankful and feeling blessed about it now. And that is this podcast and rant. It's saying hello again to Ira, bringing back this feeling, this connectivity, because it means so much. Our lives are often so banal, and we struggle so hard to just create and sustain meaning. And oftentimes, people are so shitty. We're so shitty. And it all just seems for naught. But there's moments like this one that make everything make some sense. Like, if there is another kind of world and we can sometimes make a connection with it, then that reveals not only the added dimensionality of that world, but something even bigger than that world and this one. And underneath it all and fueling it all is this sense of personality and charisma and attitude. It's the essence of intentionality. Maybe it's even what Nietzsche called the will to power, der Wille zur Macht. And I felt it then and I feel it now. And now I want to come full circle with the Trump administration now. They just are proposing renaming the Department of Defense to the Department of War. And of course they are. And they just attacked a Venezuelan vessel in international waters. Of course they did. And a business was raided in upstate New York where 500 people were apparently apprehended by ICE. Of course they did. And then we ask, what's going on? And my answer is that the Mickey Seagulls and the Ira Colitzes are running things like they ran things in Chicago for years. And now that same Tony Soprano mobster charisma is running the government. And I've podcasted about the pros and cons of this. I've shared my frustration about a lot of this. But what I'm getting at here is the transcendent power of personality. That Wille zur Macht, intention. And I really feel that the universe is, again, to get Nietzschean, beyond good and evil. It's about the raw energy of personality. And if the left, the Democrats, have made a cataclysmic mistake over the last few decades, frankly, it's the refusal to accept and acknowledge that. Obama was pure personality. The guy didn't win on policy. He won because even white people liked him. Maybe he made white people feel less racist for voting for him. He was the whitest of black guys, like that Chris Rock skit illustrated so hysterically when Chris Rock said, "I'm voting for the whitest presidential candidate, Mr. Barack Hussein Obama." Personality, not policy. And the current administration is run by a guy who has the mobster personality. And he came at the right time, at the right place. And whether you think all the policies ooze with corruption and favoritism, jingoism, quid pro quo, or if you just feel that everyone does it and this guy is just more transparent about it, the point I'm getting to with all of this, though, is just the transcendent power of attitude. That woo, that likability of these kind of personalities. And my last point, the magic of it. If you're looking for a rhyme and reason to the world, and you're looking for these interdimensional connections, don't look at them through the lens of morality, of right and wrong, of justice and fair play, because that's not the heart and soul, I think, of the universe. Instead, it's raw and energetic, selfish and self-serving, but masterfully clever and engaging. And I think that that's pretty fucking cool. Does it result in a just world? No. Hey, Toots, you wanna go to lunch? Well, the world was already changing in the early 90s. And because of it, I was Ira's plan B, plan C. Instead of the hot chick that Ira wanted to ogle, he got a Mookie whom he can bullshit with. And I'm thankful for that. But I'm also thankful for Ira coming to say goodbye. And when I open the newspapers today in 2025, almost 30 years later, 3 decades, then I see that same kind of spirit actually running the country. And it makes me wonder about the power of privilege, but more than anything else, the power of personality. So thanks for listening to the No Hair, All Heart podcast. This podcast went in all sorts of directions that I didn't really anticipate, but I am personally thankful for Ira and his memories. And I wouldn't even really call them lessons, but all the cool stuff that I learned and the inspiration that he's given me in life after he died, and decades later, when I could so joyfully and with such a blessing bring his memory back to life. Thanks so much for listening. Like, comment, share. More of these stories and more near north stories too coming your way.